Hello, everyone, and welcome to the chapter called Social Psychology as we look at how behavior is influenced in social circumstances. Let's take a look at the definition. It says here social psychology, scientific study of how people's thoughts, actions, and behaviors are influenced by the presence of others. And obviously, the more we're around people, that will affect our behavior, our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Mean Girls, and here we have Lindsay Lohan, and she was influenced by the plastics, and her behavior changed. So we'll be looking at how outside forces influence behavior. Here's a definition. Go ahead, and by the way, make sure you're writing down the definition if that helps you. If you're going to watch the videos over and over, whatever works for you, but make sure you write down the terms to prepare for the exam. So here's a term called the fundamental attribution error. Fancy word, but it's actually very easy to comprehend. It says sometimes we underestimate the impact of the situation and we overestimate the personality trait, meaning when someone is acting a certain way, we think, oh, well, that's who they are. That defines them. That is part of their personality. That's their default setting. But many times what's happening, it's all about the situation. Is it Katie Heron? Oh, wait, it's Katie. So Katie was in a brand new school and she started to act differently because of her friends. Now, is that really who she is? Or is she just acting according to the situation that she was placed in? I've had several students, I've had them in two different classes and they act completely different. In one class, they'll be kind of quiet and shy, but in another class, they'll be very talkative because they have a friend. So, which is a truer version of that student's personality? To be honest, I'm not sure. Now, I know they're not as outgoing all the time because that was their best friend, and I also know they're not that quiet as they were in my other class. It all depended on the situation. What might influence your behavior? Well, one of the things to take into consideration is culture. Everything people collectively think, do, make, or say. That's what culture is. And the way you are raised or the culture that you're surrounded by will obviously influence the way you think and therefore the way you behave. Let's look at two different types of cultures. There is something called the collectivistic culture. For example, China, India, Argentina. These don't focus on the individual. Their focus is more on the group. That would obviously influence the way a child is raised and would therefore act accordingly. The other type of culture is the individualistic culture. The United States, Germany, Australia. So here we have one of the things that will obviously influence our behavior, the culture in which we are raised. For example, here's a term. It's called the mere exposure effect. The phenomenon that repeated exposure to a novel stimuli, it's novel, something not very common to you, increases liking of them. So, for example, let's say somebody moves down to the valley and they're from a different state, let's say Michigan, and they've never really seen Delia's Tamales. So they now see the sign and they see people carrying the bags, and then they see tamales now on a regular basis. So, for example, if tamales was not part of their life, and then they move to South Texas, and and they see the bags and they see the food and they see people eating tamales, and then the way that people talk about it, like, oh my God, it's so fantastic. All of a sudden, this very foreign thing, they're now going to like it because of the exposure that they've been subjected to because of their new area of where they live. So the mere exposure effect is an example of being influenced by a group. Now, when you are part of a certain culture, you're going to learn, here's the term, a role. You can underline it, put a hyphen here. A role, a set of expectations, norms, about a social position, defining how those in the position ought to behave. If we are raised in a very specific culture, behavior is going to be expected. The role. And once those roles are carried out, that obviously is going to influence your behavior. Now, we're going to take a look at an experiment where roles are a huge, important part of the experiment. Because what happens is when somebody gives you a role, you are now going to carry out the expectations. You're going to carry out the responsibilities of that role. And it may not be a huge part of your personality, but when somebody gives you a role, now your behavior is going to change. So when we're talking about roles, one of the individuals to keep in mind who had an experiment, his name is Philip Zimbardo. Now, Philip Zimbardo did something called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And what he was trying to show was the importance of statuses and roles. In other words, your personality, your zodiac sign, your race, or your religion maybe is not as important as the statuses and roles that you've been given. So what he did was he did an experiment where he took students and he gave them different roles. They wore costumes. So this individual is dressed as a prisoner, and here we see more prisoners, and these students are dressed as prison guards or corrections officers. Now, what he was saying was, what happens in society is that when someone is given a role, they're going to act according to the role. And another thing that he was trying to say was that a lot of the things that are done in the world, a lot of the things that someone would consider evil, someone would say, well, I'm not doing something evil. I'm just doing my job. So a lot of the things that are done in the world are done by people who are just saying, hey, I'm just doing my job. I'm just carrying out my roles and statuses. One example that I've seen is that sometimes students are given uniforms to help out the security guards at a local high school. And what happens is the students start telling other students, hey, you're not supposed to be here. And the other student will say, hey, calm down. And the student wearing the badge will say, hey, I'm just doing my job. So we immediately see it. In fact, what's going to happen in your life is you're going to get a job and there'll be 4 or 5 of you working together. And then what's going to happen is someone will get a promotion and they're going to be responsible for your actions, and they're going to have to write you up, and you're going to be like, hey, well, what happened? Why did you write me up? I thought we were friends. And they're going to tell you, hey, I'm just doing my job. So Philip Zimbardo really was emphasizing the power of statuses and roles. Now, what happened is this experiment was actually brought up in court. Abu Ghraib. Now what happened is, in Iran, photos were leaked of prisoners being treated poorly. And when they went to court, the soldiers were saying, hey, we're not mean, we're not vicious, I'm just doing my job. Philip Zimbardo went to court to defend them and say, I don't want you to think of these individuals as vicious, mean individuals. I've done an experiment on this. And what happened is the fulfillment of statuses and roles